In 450 BC, when Herodotus traveled to Egypt seeking wonders to document, seeking monuments to describe, seeking mysteries to record for posterity, the priests told him something that would haunt archaeology for the next 24 centuries. They spoke of a tomb beneath the Giza plateau, a burial chamber surrounded by water, an artificial lake created by diverting Nile water through underground channels to protect the resting place of Khufu, the pharaoh who supposedly built the Great Pyramid. Herodotus never saw this tomb, was never permitted to enter the passages leading to it, was given only descriptions from priests who claimed to maintain it, who controlled access to it, who preserved its secrets across generations. He recorded what they told him, a burial chamber on an island in the center of an artificial lake, accessed through tunnels carved deep in bedrock, protected by water that would drown anyone attempting an authorized entry. The description was specific, was detailed, was memorable enough that it survived in his writings for 25 centuries despite no modern archaeologist believing such a structure actually existed. The conventional interpretation dismissed Herodotus as confused, as misled by priests who fed him stories, as recording legend rather than fact. How could such a structure exist? Where would the water come from? Why hadn't centuries of excavation around Giza revealed any trace of underground chambers matching his description? The Great Pyramid's interior had been explored, the causeway had been cleared, the surrounding area had been systematically excavated by multiple archaeological expeditions, yet nothing resembling Herodotus's flooded tomb had been discovered. Skeptics concluded he had been deceived, had recorded local folklore as history, had fallen victim to Egyptian priests who enjoyed misleading curious foreigners with tales of hidden wonders that didn't actually exist. But in 1999, Dr. Zahi Hawass stumbled upon something that would vindicate Herodotus, that would transform myth into measurable reality, that would demonstrate once again that ancient historians were often more accurate than modern scholars wanted to admit. While conducting routine excavations beneath the causeway of Khafra, the pyramid that stands between the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, Hawass discovered an opening in the tunnel floor, a shaft descending vertically into darkness, a passage that had been known to exist but whose full extent had never been properly investigated. He decided to explore, organized a team, brought equipment capable of working in flooded conditions, prepared to document whatever lay in the depths beneath the causeway. What they found matched Herodotus's description with precision that seemed impossible if the ancient historian had never seen the structure. 3 levels of chambers descending 30 meters into solid bedrock, passages flooded with crystal-clear water, and at the lowest level, a massive granite sarcophagus resting on a rectangular stone platform surrounded by water, positioned exactly as Herodotus had described an island in the center of an artificial lake. The correlation was undeniable, was specific, was detailed enough that coincidence couldn't explain it. Either Herodotus had access to accurate information about a structure he described but supposedly never entered, or the priests who told him about it were preserving genuine knowledge about underground chambers that had existed for millennia before his visit. The shaft complex wasn't simple excavation, wasn't random tunneling, showed sophisticated planning that demonstrated engineering capabilities rivaling anything visible on the Giza surface. The entrance lay directly beneath Khafra's causeway, positioned approximately halfway between the Sphinx and Khafra's funerary temple, creating geometric relationship that suggested deliberate placement coordinating underground structures with surface monuments. The location wasn't arbitrary, wasn't convenient accident of geology, reflected planning that integrated subterranean components into larger architectural systems spanning the entire plateau. The first vertical shaft, designated Shaft A by modern archaeologists, descended 9.62 meters through solid limestone before opening into Chamber A, a room carved from bedrock showing tool marks that confirmed human construction. But Chamber A was empty, contained no inscriptions, displayed no decorations, showed none of the hieroglyphic texts or painted scenes that typically covered Egyptian tomb walls. The absence was conspicuous, violated every convention of Egyptian burial practice, suggested purposes beyond simple interment that didn't require the elaborate religious texts normally incorporated into tomb architecture. From Chamber A, Shaft B descended another 9 meters to level 2, a complex arrangement of chambers far more elaborate than the sparse first level. 7 niches had been carved into the walls, creating spaces that could house multiple burials, that provided storage for ritual equipment, that served functions modern archaeologists could only speculate about because no inscriptions explained their purposes. 2 of these niches contained massive granite sarcophagi, coffins weighing multiple tons that had been lowered down the narrow shafts through methods that remain mysterious, that required engineering capabilities suggesting sophisticated understanding of mechanical advantage and careful planning. But most intriguing was the positioning of one sarcophagus, placed not within a niche but wedged into a corridor, blocking an eastern passage that appeared to lead toward the Sphinx and Valley Temple. The placement seemed deliberate, seemed designed to prevent access to spaces beyond, seemed to indicate that original builders or later users had intentionally closed routes connecting different parts of the underground complex. Why block a passage? What lay beyond that later authorities wanted sealed? Did tunnels extend from the Osiris Shaft toward other underground structures, toward the chambers detected beneath the Sphinx, toward a network of passages creating integrated systems spanning the plateau? From level 2, Shaft C descended another 12 meters into depths that required pumping before modern investigation could proceed. The shaft opened into Chamber I, the deepest and most remarkable space in the entire complex, the chamber that matched Herodotus's description so precisely that it seemed the ancient historian must have possessed accurate information despite claims he never personally entered the structure. The chamber contained a rectangular stone platform surrounded by water that had filled the space from underground aquifers, from groundwater seeping through porous limestone, from sources that ensured the chamber remained flooded regardless of surface conditions. On the platform rested a granite sarcophagus weighing between 10 and 15 tons, a massive coffin that dwarfed anything found in the chambers above, that required enormous effort to position, that demonstrated commitment of resources suggesting whoever was meant to rest here held significance far exceeding ordinary burials. For stone pillars, now partially collapsed, once stood at the corners of the platform, creating architectural arrangement that echoed depictions of Osiris's mythological burial, that replicated the god's resting place as described in ancient texts, that transformed the chamber from simple tomb into symbolic recreation of underworld geography. The sarcophagus, when finally examined after weeks of pumping lowered water levels sufficiently for access, was empty. No mummy, no burial goods, no golden artifacts, no funerary equipment. The massive coffin that had required such effort to position, that occupied the central place in such elaborate complex, that represented culmination of 3 levels of carefully constructed chambers, contained nothing. The absence raised more questions than discovery of a body would have answered. Was this ceremonial burial, symbolic tomb for a god rather than actual interment? Was the sarcophagus placeholder for burial that never occurred? Or had contents been removed, stolen by ancient tomb robbers who somehow accessed the flooded chamber, who removed whatever treasures it contained while leaving the massive stone coffin they couldn't extract? The parallels to the Osirian at Abydos were impossible to miss, strengthened identification of this complex with Osiris rather than any historical pharaoh. The Osirian, another underground structure associated with Osiris worship, featured similar architectural elements, similar water surrounding central burial platform, similar absence of typical tomb decoration or inscriptions. Both structures seem designed to recreate mythological geography, to create physical manifestation of underworld described in religious texts, to provide space where ritual could connect living worshippers with powers of death and resurrection that Osiris represented. But if this was purely symbolic, purely ceremonial, purely religious architecture without connection to actual burials, then why such enormous investment of resources? Why excavate 30 meters into solid bedrock? Why create 3 levels of chambers when single symbolic space would serve religious purposes? Why position massive granite sarcophagi that required sophisticated engineering to install? The scale suggested purposes beyond mere symbolism, implied functions requiring actual physical presence in underground chambers, indicated that whatever occurred here needed spaces that couldn't be substituted with surface temples or simpler underground facilities. The discovery's timing was perfect for validating ancient historians, for demonstrating that classical sources deserved more respect than modern skepticism typically granted them. Herodotus had described structure matching what Horace found with specificity that coincidence couldn't explain. The island in the artificial lake, the burial chamber accessed through underground passages, the water protection system, all existed exactly as the ancient historian had recorded despite never seeing them personally. His sources had been accurate, had preserved genuine knowledge about underground structures, had maintained information across centuries until Greek visitor arrived who would record it for posterity. Yet questions remained, mysteries that discovery raised rather than resolved. How old was the Osiris Shaft? When was it constructed? Who ordered its excavation? Dating proved difficult, contradictory, frustrating for archaeologists seeking definitive answers. Pottery shards recovered from Shaft C suggested construction during Egypt's 6th dynasty, approximately 2345 to 2181 BC, making the complex roughly contemporary with later Old Kingdom pyramids. But the granite sarcophagus in the lowest chamber showed stylistic features characteristic of 26th dynasty work, approximately 664 to 525 BC, creating chronological gap of 1500 years between supposed construction and burial equipment installation. This chronological confusion suggested the shaft complex had been built during one period then reused during another, that original purposes had been forgotten or transformed, that later Egyptians discovering ancient chambers had adapted them for contemporary religious practices without fully understanding what the original builders intended. Or perhaps the shaft was far older than pottery evidence suggested, perhaps it predated dynastic Egypt entirely, perhaps it belonged to civilization about which conventional archaeology knew nothing because accepting its existence would require abandoning comfortable chronologies and established narratives about human technological development. The discovery should have triggered intensive investigation, should have launched comprehensive excavation of surrounding areas seeking connections to other underground structures, should have prompted systematic exploration of passages that preliminary work suggested extended beyond map chambers. Instead, it generated brief publicity followed by restrictions, generated excitement followed by obstruction, generated questions that authorities apparently preferred remain unanswered because asking them led toward conclusions that threatened orthodox understanding of what lay beneath the Giza plateau, of how extensively the underground system extended, of whether the shaft complex was isolated feature or node in network connecting multiple sites across the plateau through passages that ancient builders had carved but modern archaeology had barely begun to explore despite technology capable of detection. Despite evidence demanding investigation, despite everything suggesting that Herodotus's flooded tomb was merely one visible element of infrastructure extending far beyond what 30 meters of excavation had revealed, infrastructure that might connect to chambers beneath the Sphinx, to the labyrinth at Hawara, to underground facilities throughout Egypt that ancient texts described but that modern suppression ensured would remain mysterious, would stay unexplored, would continue guarding. Secrets that apparently some people preferred stay buried in flooded darkness where Herodotus had recorded them, where priests had protected them, where stone and water collaborated to preserve what 25 centuries of skepticism hadn't destroyed and what modern discovery had finally, definitively, proven existed exactly as ancient historians had accurately documented despite generations of scholars insisting they were wrong. The descent into the Osiris Shaft wasn't journey for the casual explorer, wasn't casual archaeological excavation, wasn't something that could be accomplished with simple tools and curiosity. Hawassa's team faced challenges that tested modern engineering, required equipment that ancient builders couldn't have possessed, demanded skills that made discovery all the more remarkable when one considered how the original excavation had been accomplished using copper tools, rope, wooden scaffolding, and human muscle power working in darkness broken only by oil lamps and torches. Shaft A, the entry point descending from the causeway tunnel, measured 2.60 by 3.00 meters at its opening, rectangular rather than square, roughly hewn rather than precisely cut, showing tool marks that suggested speed of excavation mattered more than aesthetic perfection. The shaft dropped 9.62 meters straight down through solid limestone, creating vertical passage that required climbing or being lowered on ropes, that presented genuine danger to anyone attempting descent without proper equipment, that demonstrated commitment suggesting whatever lay below justified the risk and effort required to reach it. At the bottom of Shaft A, Chamber A opened to the north, extending 8.60 meters in length, varying between 2.65 and 2.70 meters in height, carved from bedrock with walls that remained rough, that showed none of the smoothing or decorating that typically characterized Egyptian tomb chambers. The floor was uneven, the ceiling sloped irregularly, the entire space gave impression of functional excavation rather than finished architecture, as though whoever carved it prioritized reaching deeper levels over creating pleasant environment at this intermediate stage. Chamber A's most striking feature was its emptiness, its complete absence of inscriptions, decorations, artifacts, or any indication of what purpose it served. Egyptian tombs typically announced their occupants, praised their achievements, invoked protective spells, covered every available surface with hieroglyphs ensuring safe passage to the afterlife. Chamber A showed none of this, remained silent and anonymous, offered no explanation for its existence beyond serving as junction between upper and lower levels, as transition space whose purposes remained mysterious because nothing indicated what those purposes were. The absence of decoration wasn't oversight, wasn't result of incomplete work, wasn't accident of time eroding what had once existed. The chamber walls showed no traces of plaster that would have been applied before painting, no shallow cuts where hieroglyphs would have been carved, no preparation for embellishment that was planned but never executed. The emptiness appeared intentional, appeared designed, appeared to indicate that whatever occurred in this space didn't require or didn't permit the standard religious imagery that covered other Egyptian tomb walls. From Chamber A's floor, Shaft B descended another 9 meters, doubling the depth, creating cumulative descent of approximately 18.5 meters that represented serious excavation, that required removing tens of cubic meters of limestone, that demonstrated determination suggesting important purposes justified the effort. Shaft B was narrower than Shaft A, measuring roughly 1.65 by 1.90 meters, creating tighter passage that made descending more difficult, that limited what could be lowered to chambers below, that suggested either that Level 2's contents required less space than Level 1's entrance or that builders wanted to control access by making the shaft physically challenging to navigate. Level 2 presented dramatically more complex architecture than the sparse Chamber A above it, showed planning and organization suggesting this level represented significant functional space rather than mere transitional junction. 7 niches had been carved into the walls, creating alcoves that extended into the bedrock, that provided spaces whose purposes excavators could only speculate about because no inscriptions explained them, because artifacts found within were limited and didn't clearly indicate original functions. 2 of these niches contained massive granite sarcophagi, coffins whose weight exceeded anything that should have fit through the narrow shaft's connecting levels, that raised immediate questions about construction sequence and methodology. Had the sarcophagi been carved in place from granite blocks lowered in pieces then assembled in the chambers? Had the shafts been wider during construction then deliberately narrowed after sarcophagi were positioned? Had some alternative method, some technique lost to later periods, enabled moving such massive objects through spaces barely adequate for human passage? The sarcophagi themselves showed characteristics suggesting 26th dynasty manufacture, approximately 664 to 525 BC, based on style, proportions, stone working techniques visible in their construction. But if Level 2's chambers had been excavated during Old Kingdom's 6th dynasty as pottery evidence from lower levels suggested, then the sarcophagi were installed more than 1500 years after the chambers were carved, were additions to pre-existing spaces, represented reuse of ancient facility whose original purposes were forgotten or transformed by later periods discovering underground chambers and adapting them for contemporary religious practices. But Level 2's most intriguing feature, the detail that suggested purposes beyond simple burial, the architectural element that indicated connections to larger underground system, was the blocked eastern passage. One of the massive granite sarcophagi had been wedged into a corridor, positioned to prevent access to spaces beyond, placed with clear intention of closing route that once connected different parts of the complex. The placement wasn't accidental, wasn't result of careless storage, showed deliberate effort to create barrier that couldn't be easily removed without major excavation. The blocked passage ran eastward, oriented toward the Sphinx and Valley Temple, suggested connections between the Osiris Shaft and other underground structures that archaeologists had long speculated existed but had never definitively located. If passages extended from Level 2 toward the Sphinx, if tunnels created network connecting different monuments through subterranean routes, if the underground infrastructure was far more extensive than surface archaeology suggested, then the blocked passage represented deliberate severance of that network, represented decision to prevent access across connections that original builders had created. Why block the passage? What lay beyond that later authorities wanted sealed? Did the tunnel connect to chambers beneath the Sphinx, to the Hall of Records that Edgar Cayce had predicted and that radar surveys had detected? Did it lead to the labyrinth at Hawara, to other underground facilities scattered across Egypt? Or did it simply connect to natural caves that became dangerous, to spaces that flooded and became impassable, to areas where structural instability made access unsafe regardless of what they might contain? The evidence suggested intentional closure rather than natural blockage, suggested that someone with authority had decided the passage shouldn't be used, had committed resources to filling or blocking it with obstacles requiring significant effort to remove. The massive sarcophagus positioned in the corridor wasn't random debris, wasn't collapse from ceiling failure, was placement that required deliberate effort and planning, that transformed burial equipment into architectural barrier, that repurposed religious artifact for security function, suggesting whatever lay beyond was important enough that preventing access justified any available means, including sacrificing valuable granite coffin to serve as permanent plug. From Level 2, Shaft C descended the final 12 meters into depths where groundwater had accumulated, where pumping became necessary before modern investigation could proceed, where ancient builders had worked in conditions that must have required constant bailing, constant management of water seeping through porous limestone, constant battle against flooding that eventually won after the complex was abandoned and maintenance ceased. The shaft descended from a rectangular niche carved into Level 2's floor, passed through 7 smaller niches cut into the shaft walls themselves, niches that appeared designed to support wooden beams that could control descent of heavy objects, that could serve as attachment points for ropes and pulleys, that indicated the builders anticipated needing to lower something massive into Chamber I below. Chamber I, the lowest and most remarkable space in the entire Osiris Shaft complex, vindicated Herodotus with specificity that bordered on uncanny, that demonstrated the ancient historian had possessed accurate information despite never seeing the chamber personally, that proved once again that classical sources deserved respect rather than dismissal when they recorded details about structures they described. The chamber measured approximately 9 by 8 meters, created substantial space carved 30 meters into bedrock, represented culmination of engineering effort that had excavated hundreds of cubic meters of limestone to create vertical shafts and horizontal chambers spanning 3 levels of complex organization. In the center of Chamber I, a rectangular stone platform rose from the floor, creating island exactly as Herodotus had described, positioned to be surrounded by water that filled the chamber from groundwater sources, from aquifers that ensured the space remained flooded regardless of surface conditions. for stone pillars, now partially collapsed but originally standing at the platform's corners, created architectural arrangement that echoed depictions of Osiris mythology, that replicated descriptions of the god's burial place, that transformed the chamber from simple tomb into symbolic recreation of underworld geography as ancient religious texts described it. On the platform rested a granite sarcophagus of monumental proportions, weighing between 10 and 15 tons according to estimates based on granite density and the coffin's dimensions, representing massive object whose installation required engineering capabilities that made modern excavators marvel at ancient achievement. How had this enormous granite coffin been lowered 30 meters through narrow shafts? What techniques had enabled positioning it precisely on the platform? What knowledge of mechanics, of materials, of structural engineering had the builders possessed that allowed them to accomplish what seemed nearly impossible even with modern equipment? The sarcophagus, like the chamber that housed it, remained anonymous, bore no inscriptions identifying its intended occupant, displayed no hieroglyphs invoking protection or describing achievements, showed none of the standard textual elements that covered other Egyptian burial equipment. The silence was deliberate, was consistent with Chamber A's similar lack of inscription, suggested that whoever this complex served either didn't require textual protection or operated under different religious conventions than standard Egyptian burial practices assumed, or represented purposes that transcended individual burial and thus didn't need personalized identification that tombs normally required. And when Hawassa's team finally examined the sarcophagus after weeks of pumping had lowered water levels sufficiently for access, after enormous effort had been expended clearing Chamber I enough to approach the platform and lift the massive granite lid, they found what both disappointed and deepened the mystery: nothing. The sarcophagus was empty, contained no mummy, no burial goods, no artifacts, no indication that it had ever served as actual burial receptacle rather than symbolic representation, ceremonial focus, or placeholder for interment that never occurred or whose contents had been removed so thoroughly that no traces remained. The empty sarcophagus transformed the Osiris Shaft from probable tomb into architectural mystery, from burial complex into structure whose purposes remained unclear because conventional interpretation couldn't explain why such enormous effort would create facility that apparently never served the burial function that its design suggested. Was this Osiris's symbolic tomb, religious theatre recreating mythology without requiring actual body? Was it burial prepared for pharaoh who died elsewhere or whose plans changed? Was it ancient facility whose original purposes were so completely forgotten that later Egyptians discovering it could only guess at its functions and adapt it for ritual use it hadn't been designed for? The three levels, the progression from sparse Chamber A through complex level 2 to elaborate Chamber I, suggested intentional sequence, suggested journey rather than simple destination, suggested that descent through the shaft complex represented process with meaning beyond merely reaching bottom chamber. The architecture encoded progression, encoded stages, encoded transformation that occurred through movement between levels, through passage from surface world through intermediate spaces into flooded chamber that symbolically represented underworld, represented death and rebirth, represented Osiris's domain where transformation occurred that religious texts described but whose physical manifestation the Osiris Shaft apparently provided for initiates who descended 30 meters into darkness to emerge transformed, renewed, having experienced whatever mysteries the chambers facilitated in depths beneath the Giza plateau where stone and water collaborated to create spaces that conventional tomb interpretation couldn't adequately explain but that clearly served purposes important enough to justify excavation effort that rivaled anything attempted in service of actual burials. The pumping operation that cleared Chamber I represented engineering challenge that tested modern equipment, required weeks of continuous work, demanded resources that ancient builders couldn't have possessed yet somehow managed without. Ismail Osman, head of Osman Contractors, provided industrial pumps capable of moving hundreds of gallons per minute, connected them through pipes running 30 meters up through shafts C, B, and A to discharge water onto the plateau surface. The noise was deafening, made working conditions almost unbearable, created vibrations that threatened the shaft's structural integrity with every hour the pumps ran. but the water fought back, refused to submit easily, demonstrated that its presence in Chamber I wasn't merely inconvenient flooding but rather fundamental characteristic of the space's design and function. As fast as pumps removed water from the chamber, groundwater seeped back through porous limestone, flowed from aquifers that connected to underground water systems extending across the entire plateau, maintained levels that suggested deliberate engineering rather than accidental infiltration. The builders had positioned Chamber I at precise depth where groundwater would naturally accumulate, had created artificial lake that required no human maintenance, had designed self-sustaining system that functioned automatically through geological processes rather than mechanical intervention. The crystal clarity of the water surprised everyone who saw it, contradicted expectations about stagnant underground pools, suggested movement that prevented bacterial growth, indicated circulation that freshened the chamber despite its being sealed 30 meters below surface. Horace described the water as pure enough to drink, clean enough to see through perfectly, maintained at quality that seemed impossible for static underground reservoir. The clarity suggested connections to larger water systems, suggested flow rather than stagnation, indicated that Chamber I wasn't isolated pool but rather node in network of underground channels that moved groundwater across the plateau. As water levels dropped, the sarcophagus emerged gradually from depths, revealed its massive proportions, demonstrated scale that made observers marvel at how ancient builders had positioned it. The granite coffin measured approximately 2.70 meters long, 1.20 meters wide, 1.00 meter high, created rectangular box whose walls were 25 centimeters thick, whose total weight exceeded 10 tons and possibly approached 15 depending on granite density and internal dimensions. The lid alone weighed several tons, required multiple workers and sophisticated lifting equipment to remove, presented challenge even for modern excavators with their mechanical advantages that ancient builders supposedly lacked. The sarcophagus rested on the rectangular stone platform that occupied Chamber I's center, positioned precisely in the middle, oriented along east-west axis with deliberate alignment suggesting astronomical or religious significance. The platform itself represented significant construction, required carving bedrock into level surface, demanded precision suggesting careful surveying and measurement, demonstrated that whoever built this complex understood importance of orientation, of positioning, of creating spatial relationships that served purposes beyond mere structural necessity. For stone pillars, partially collapsed but originally standing at platform corners, created architectural arrangement echoing descriptions found in pyramid texts and coffin texts, matched layout of mythological geography describing Osiris's burial, replicated symbolic architecture that religious literature described but that few physical structures actually manifested. The pillars weren't decorative, weren't structural supports for ceiling that needed no such reinforcement, served symbolic function representing the four sons of Horus, the protective deities who guarded Osiris's body, the divine beings who ensured resurrection and eternal life for the god who ruled the underworld. The parallel to the Osirian at Abydos was impossible to miss, strengthened identification of Chamber I with Osiris worship rather than conventional burial practices. The Osirian, built during Seti I's reign in New Kingdom, featured similar water-surrounded central platform, similar stone pillars at corners, similar absence of typical tomb decoration or personalized inscriptions. Both structures recreated mythological landscape, transformed religious symbolism into physical architecture, created spaces where ritual could connect living participants with powers of death and transformation that Osiris embodied. But the Osirian was built approximately 1290 BC, more than 1,000 years after pottery evidence suggested the Osiris Shaft was excavated during 6th dynasty around 2300 BC. If the Osiris Shaft preceded the Osirian, if its design influenced later structure at Abydos, then it represented original expression of architectural ideas that New Kingdom builders would later copy, represented prototype for ritual spaces that subsequent periods would recreate because original had demonstrated effectiveness, had proven capable of facilitating whatever transformative experiences Egyptian religion associated with Osiris mysteries. The lifting of the sarcophagus lid required careful preparation, demanded equipment capable of handling multi-ton weight, needed planning that ensured no damage occurred to ancient artifact that had survived millennia only to be destroyed by careless modern handling. The lid was monolithic, carved from single block of red granite, polished to smoothness that reflected light even after thousands of years submerged, showed craftsmanship suggesting master stone workers whose skills enabled precision that lesser artisans couldn't match. The corners were perfect right angles, the surfaces were parallel planes, the dimensions showed consistency indicating careful measurement and quality control during manufacture. When the lid finally lifted, when the interior became visible for first time in possibly thousands of years, when modern eyes looked into space that ancient hands had sealed, the emptiness was simultaneously disappointing and profoundly mysterious. No mummy wrapped in linen, no golden mask covering royal features, no canopic jars preserving internal organs, no amulets providing magical protection, no shabti figures serving deceased in afterlife, no furniture accompanying soul to next world, no food offering sustaining spirit during transformation. The sarcophagus contained nothing, was completely empty, showed no traces of ever having held body or burial goods or anything suggesting it had served function that its design implied. The interior surfaces were smooth, showed no evidence of decomposition, revealed no organic residue that chemical analysis could detect, preserved no DNA that modern testing could amplify and identify. If body had once rested here, if burial had occurred before tomb robbers entered the sarcophagus, if someone had been interred then later removed, no evidence survived beyond the fact of the empty granite box itself. The absence was complete, was absolute, was so thorough that it suggested perhaps no burial had ever occurred, perhaps the sarcophagus had always been empty, perhaps its purpose was symbolic rather than functional. This interpretation gained support from the sarcophagus's positioning, from its placement in chamber that required descending 30 meters through flooded spaces, from its location in complex that violated every convention of Egyptian burial architecture. Tombs were designed for accessibility by funerary priests who maintained offerings, who performed daily rituals, who ensured deceased received sustenance and attention enabling successful afterlife existence. Placing burial 30 meters down through narrow shafts, in chamber that naturally flooded, in location requiring constant pumping to remain accessible, made no sense if actual body needed regular priestly service. But if the sarcophagus served different purpose, if chamber I functioned as initiatory space rather than burial chamber, if the entire Osiris Shaft complex facilitated ritual transformation rather than housing corpse, then the empty sarcophagus made perfect sense. Initiates would descend through levels representing stages of transformation, would undergo ordeals testing their worthiness, would finally reach chamber I where they would lie in the sarcophagus symbolizing death, would remain there while priests performed rituals invoking Osiris's power, would emerge reborn having experienced symbolic death and resurrection that initiation mysteries across ancient world consistently incorporated as central transformative element. The water surrounding the platform added another layer to this interpretation, provided element that numerous ancient traditions associated with purification, with cleansing, with transition between states of being. Immersion in water marked boundaries, separated profane from sacred, enabled transformations that dry rituals couldn't accomplish. If initiates waded through chamber I's water, if they crossed from entrance to platform through liquid element, if they emerged from water onto island where sarcophagus waited, then the journey itself became ritual, became performance encoding meanings that participants experienced bodily rather than merely intellectually understanding. The positioning of chamber I at depth where groundwater naturally accumulated might have been deliberate choice rather than inconvenient consequence of excavation depth, might represent engineering achievement creating permanent self-maintaining water feature rather than design flaw requiring constant pumping to overcome. Ancient builders who could calculate where groundwater would accumulate, who could position chambers at precise depths where aquifers would ensure flooding, who could create spaces that water would naturally maintain at desired levels, demonstrated understanding of hydrology that conventional assessments of ancient capabilities typically underestimate. The clarity of the water, its purity despite being underground pool with no visible circulation, suggested either that builders had created drainage systems modern excavators hadn't detected or that natural geological features provided flow sufficient to prevent stagnation. Either explanation indicated sophisticated understanding of how underground water behaved, how to harness natural processes to serve architectural purposes, how to create sustainable systems that functioned without human intervention across centuries or millennia. The symbolism encoded in Chamber I's architecture resonated with pyramid texts' descriptions of transformation, with coffin texts' references to rebirth, with Book of Dead's guidance for navigating underworld. The descent through shafts paralleled Soul's journey into realm of Osiris, the water crossing replicated separation from living world, the central platform represented Primeval Mound emerging from chaos waters at creation, the sarcophagus symbolized both death and womb of rebirth, the four pillars invoked protective powers ensuring safe transformation from one state to another. But whether this symbolism served purely religious purposes or encoded practical knowledge about consciousness transformation, about techniques for inducing altered states, about methodologies for psychological change that ancient priests had discovered and preserved through architectural metaphor, remains uncertain. Modern understanding of initiation mysteries across ancient cultures suggests they often involved actual psychological techniques, genuine methods for producing transformative experiences, real practices that participants underwent rather than merely symbolic performances they observed. If Chamber I facilitated such practices, if its design incorporated features that produce specific psychological or physiological effects, if the combination of descent, darkness, sensory deprivation, immersion, and eventual emergence created conditions enabling genuine transformation of consciousness, then the empty sarcophagus wasn't absence of expected contents but rather evidence of Chamber's true function. Space designed not for housing corpse but for temporarily containing living person. Undergoing experience that Egyptian tradition described as dying and being reborn, as passing through Osiris's realm, as achieving transformation that marked transition from ordinary consciousness to elevated state that initiates possessed after completing mysteries that the Osiris Shaft existed to facilitate. And perhaps that's why the sarcophagus remains empty today, why no burial goods were ever placed in Chamber I, why the complex violates conventional tomb architecture. It was never meant to house dead body permanently but rather to temporarily contain living initiate undergoing ritual death, experiencing symbolic transformation, emerging renewed to climb back through the shafts carrying knowledge that descent had granted, understanding that darkness had revealed, consciousness that death and rebirth in Osiris's flooded chamber had permanently altered in ways that those who never descended could neither achieve nor comprehend because some transformations require actual journey into depths, require submersion in waters of chaos, require lying in granite sarcophagus while ritual enacts death that precedes all genuine rebirth, all authentic transformation, all passage from one state of being to fundamentally different state that Egyptian mysteries apparently understood and encoded in architecture that still waits 30 meters beneath the Giza plateau where water maintains the space exactly as ancient builders designed it, where emptiness testifies to purposes that modern assumptions about tombs and burials can't adequately explain, but that careful examination of evidence increasingly suggests served functions that went far beyond housing corpse and extended into realms of human transformation that ancient wisdom explored more deeply than later ages often recognize. The eastern passage that one of Level 2's massive granite sarcophagi had been wedged into represented perhaps the most tantalizing mystery of the entire Osiris Shaft complex, the architectural feature that transformed isolated tomb into potential node of larger underground network, the blocked corridor that suggested connections extending far beyond the 30 meters that excavation had reached. The passage ran eastward from Level 2, oriented directly toward the Sphinx and Valley Temple, followed trajectory that if extended would pass beneath the causeway and potentially connect to chambers that radar surveys had detected beneath the lion-bodied guardian that watched over the Giza plateau. The blocking wasn't subtle, wasn't accidental placement of storage that happened to obstruct passage, showed deliberate effort to prevent access to spaces beyond. The granite sarcophagus that filled the corridor had been positioned carefully, had been wedged into opening with precision suggesting intention rather than convenience, created barrier that couldn't be easily removed without major excavation and risk of damaging both the sarcophagus and the passage walls. Whoever placed it there wanted the route closed, wanted to prevent anyone from following the corridor eastward, wanted to ensure that connection between Osiris Shaft and whatever lay beyond remained severed. The question that burned through everyone examining this feature was simple but profound: what lay beyond the blocked passage that someone considered important enough to seal using valuable burial equipment as architectural barrier? If the passage simply dead-ended after short distance, if it led to natural cave that had become unstable, if it connected to nothing significant, then why bother blocking it so thoroughly? The effort required to position the massive sarcophagus suggested the passage led somewhere, connected to something, accessed spaces that authorities wanted kept separate from the Osiris Shaft proper. The most obvious hypothesis, the interpretation that ancient Egyptian traditions and modern discoveries both supported, suggested the passage connected to chambers beneath the Sphinx, to the Hall of Records that Edgar Cayce had prophesied and that 2008 radar surveys had detected. If underground tunnels linked different monuments at Giza, if the plateau concealed integrated network of passages connecting pyramids to Sphinx to Valley Temple through subterranean routes, then the Osiris Shaft's eastern corridor represented one element of that network, one connection that original builders had created but that later authorities had decided to close. The timing of the blocking remained uncertain, couldn't be determined from available evidence, depended on dating the sarcophagus itself and determining when it had been moved from storage position to blocking position. The 26th dynasty stylistic features suggested the coffin dated to approximately 664 to 525 BC, but that indicated when it was manufactured, not when it was repurposed as barrier. The blocking might have occurred during the same period, might represent late-period decision to seal passages connecting different parts of the underground system, might reflect religious or political motivations that made maintaining connections undesirable or dangerous. Or the blocking might have occurred much later, might represent Ptolemaic or Roman period intervention, might reflect decisions by foreign rulers who discovered the passages and chose to seal them for reasons their records didn't preserve. The absence of inscription on the blocking sarcophagus, the lack of documentation about why or when the passage was closed, the silence that surrounded this significant architectural modification, all suggested that whoever blocked the corridor preferred not to advertise the act, preferred to close the connection without creating permanent record explaining the decision. The parallel to similar blocked passages throughout Egypt's underground structures strengthened interpretation that systematic policy rather than isolated decision had motivated the closure. The labyrinth at Hawara showed evidence of deliberately filled passages, of routes that had been closed using stone blocks and rubble rather than simply being left to natural collapse. The chambers beneath the Sphinx had been sealed using methods that suggested intentional rather than accidental closure. The pattern suggested coordinated effort, suggested someone with authority across multiple sites had decided that underground connections should be severed, that maintaining network integrity was undesirable, that whatever purposes the passages served had become problematic enough to justify permanent closure. The Osiris Shaft's position, roughly halfway between Khafra's pyramid and the Sphinx, created geometric relationship that suggested deliberate planning coordinating surface monuments with underground infrastructure. If passages extended both east toward the Sphinx and west toward the pyramids, if the shaft represented junction point in network spanning the plateau, if it served as intersection where routes from different monuments converged, then its location wasn't accidental but rather carefully chosen to facilitate movement between different parts of the underground system. This interpretation transformed the Osiris Shaft from isolated burial complex into transportation hub, from religious facility into functional infrastructure, from symbolic tomb into practical architecture serving purposes that required physical connectivity between different locations. If priests needed to move between pyramid ceremonies and Sphinx rituals without being seen by public on the causeway, if initiates underwent multi-stage transformations requiring presence at different underground sites, if materials or knowledge needed to be transferred between monuments through routes that surface observation couldn't detect, then passages connecting different parts of the plateau served essential functions that isolated chambers couldn't provide. The blocked Eastern Passage also raised questions about what modern authorities knew regarding underground connections, about whether investigations beyond what had been publicly disclosed had revealed passages extending from the Osiris Shaft, about whether the same pattern of suppression that characterized research beneath the Sphinx and excavation of the labyrinth also applied to exploring blocked corridors at level 2. The absence of published research about the Eastern Passage, the lack of radar surveys mapping its extent, the silence about whether it actually connects to chambers beneath the Sphinx, all suggested that investigation either hadn't been permitted or had been conducted but results were classified. The 2025 Italian radar discoveries that detected massive underground structures beneath the Giza plateau, those 8 vertical shafts descending 650 meters with spiral pathways and cubic chambers at their bases, strengthened the case that the Osiris Shaft represented merely one visible element of far more extensive infrastructure. If underground network connected different monuments through passages at multiple depths, if the Osiris Shaft's 30-meter excavation barely scratched the surface of what lay below, if deeper shafts descended hundreds of meters into structures that conventional archaeology insisted couldn't exist, then the blocked Eastern Passage at level 2 might connect not just to chambers beneath the Sphinx but to deeper levels of underground system that no modern investigation had successfully explored. The strategic importance of controlling access to such network would explain the blocking, would justify using valuable sarcophagus as barrier, would account for absence of documentation about when or why the closure occurred. If the passages connected monuments whose symbolic and religious significance was enormous, if they provided routes that initiated could use to access multiple sacred sites without surface observation, if they contained spaces where rituals or knowledge transmission occurred that authorities wanted to restrict or control, then maintaining security meant ensuring that unauthorized persons couldn't navigate the network, couldn't discover connections between sites, couldn't access chambers that were meant to remain restricted to those with proper authorization and training. The blocked passage thus represented both archaeological mystery and security feature, both evidence of ancient connectivity and demonstration of ancient access control, both tantalizing suggestion of what might lie beyond and frustrating obstacle preventing modern investigation from determining what actually existed in spaces the sarcophagus protected. The granite barrier that filled the corridor ensured that the Eastern Passage secrets would remain hidden unless someone with authority decided that removal was justified, unless circumstances changed sufficiently that exploring beyond the blockage became permitted, unless priorities shifted from protecting whatever lay beyond to discovering what the passage connected to and what purposes those connections served in system that ancient builders had created but that modern suppression apparently considered too sensitive to fully explore despite technology capable of detection, despite evidence demanding investigation. Despite everything suggesting that the Osiris Shaft's blocked Eastern Passage represented merely one element of underground network extending across the entire Giza plateau connecting monuments through passages that conventional archaeology had barely begun to map much less understand in terms of purposes they served, functions they enabled, or knowledge they might preserve if investigation were finally permitted to proceed beyond blocked corridors, beyond suppressed research, beyond restrictions that ensured the underground network would remain mysterious, would stay largely unexplored, would continue guarding secrets that stone barriers and modern authorities collaborated to protect from discovery that apparently wasn't supposed to occur regardless of what radar detected beneath the plateau or what blocked passages suggested about connectivity between sites that ancient wisdom had integrated into unified system but that modern investigation remained prohibited from fully documenting. The identification of the shaft complex with Osiris wasn't arbitrary choice, wasn't modern archaeological speculation imposed on ancient structure, derived directly from the architecture itself, from the symbolism encoded in chamber eyes design, from religious texts that describe the god's burial in terms matching what excavation revealed. Osiris represented death and resurrection, ruled the underworld, judged souls, controlled the powers of transformation that turned corpses into eternal beings, governed the realm that all Egyptians hoped to reach after life ended. His mythology was central to Egyptian religious thought, shaped burial practices, influenced architecture, determined how tombs were designed and equipped. The Osiris story, preserved in fragments across multiple sources and most completely recorded by Plutarch centuries after Egyptian religion had ceased being actively practiced, told of god-king murdered by jealous brother, body dismembered and scattered across Egypt, pieces recovered by devoted wife who reassembled them and through magic restored life long enough for conception of son who would eventually avenge his father. The murdered god didn't return to earthly existence but rather became ruler of the underworld, became judge determining who deserved eternal life, became source of resurrection power that all deceased hoped to access through proper burial and correct performance of funerary rituals. The myth encoded themes that appeared throughout ancient Egyptian thought. Death wasn't end but transition, proper treatment of body enabled continuation of existence, dismemberment could be overcome through knowledge and magic, resurrection was possible for those who understood correct procedures. These themes influenced how Egyptians approached death, shaped elaborate mummification practices, determined tomb architecture, motivated creation of extensive funerary literature providing guidance for navigating afterlife challenges. Osiris wasn't merely a religious figure but rather embodiment of fundamental Egyptian beliefs about death's nature and possibilities for transcending it. Chamber Eye's design replicated key elements of Osiris mythology with specificity that couldn't be coincidental, that demonstrated builders' deliberate intention to create physical manifestation of religious narrative, that transformed abstract story into architectural reality where ritual could occur, where transformation could be experienced, where death and resurrection could be enacted rather than merely discussed. The water surrounding the central platform matched descriptions of Osiris's burial, the god whose body according to myth had been thrown into the Nile, whose pieces had floated downstream until Isis recovered them, whose resurrection involved water as essential element enabling transformation from death to renewed life. The 4 stone pillars at the platform's corners represented the 4 sons of Horus, protective deities who in funerary texts guarded Osiris's body, who stood at cardinal directions ensuring no harm could reach the god, who symbolized completeness and security and proper order that made resurrection possible. Their presence in Chamber Eye wasn't decorative, wasn't aesthetic choice, served specific religious function recreating mythological geography, establishing space as authentic Osiris location, enabling rituals performed there to connect participants with actual divine powers rather than merely symbolic representations. The sarcophagus positioned on the platform completed the symbolic ensemble, provided focus for ritual activity, offered space where transformation could occur, created architectural equivalent of the mythological moment when Osiris lay dead before resurrection, when potential for renewed life existed but hadn't yet manifested, when magic and ritual could tip balance from permanent death to eternal existence. The massive granite coffin wasn't container for actual body but rather ritual object, sacred space, transformative environment where initiates could experience symbolic death and emerge reborn having accessed Osiris's power, having undergone journey through underworld, having achieved transformation that ordinary death and burial couldn't accomplish. But the question that troubled modern researchers, that separated conventional archaeological interpretation from alternative theories, that determined whether the Osiris Shaft was purely religious theatre or something more substantive, centered on whether the symbolism served only abstract spiritual purposes or encoded actual techniques, actual knowledge, actual practices that produce genuine psychological or physiological effects on participants. Ancient mystery religions across Mediterranean world consistently incorporated initiation ceremonies that participants described as genuinely transformative, as experiences that permanently altered consciousness, as ordeals that separated initiates from ordinary persons through knowledge or experience that couldn't be communicated to uninitiated. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece promised initiates blessed afterlife, provided experiences that participants described as life-changing, maintained secrecy so complete that despite centuries of initiations and thousands of participants, no detailed accounts of actual ceremonies survived. The Dionysian mysteries incorporated ecstatic experiences, altered consciousness through wine and dance and ritual, created states where participants felt union with divine, experienced transformation that ordinary religious observance didn't provide. The Mithraic mysteries, popular among Roman soldiers, involved descents into underground temples, ordeals testing courage and determination, initiatory sequences that participants passed through gaining knowledge at each stage. Egyptian mystery traditions, older than Greek or Roman versions, likely influenced later developments, provided templates that other cultures adapted, preserved knowledge about consciousness transformation that Mediterranean civilizations inherited and modified. If the Osiris Shaft served similar functions, if it facilitated genuine initiatory experiences rather than merely symbolic performances, if its design incorporated features that produce specific psychological effects on participants descending into darkness 30 meters below surface, then the architectural details weren't arbitrary but rather carefully calculated elements creating environment capable of inducing targeted states of consciousness. The descent itself, the journey through 3 levels progressively deeper into Earth, replicated symbolic death, enacted separation from surface world, created conditions for transformation that required leaving normal existence behind. Chamber A's emptiness served as transition space, as pause between surface and depths, as moment for preparation before continuing descent into more challenging levels. Level 2's complexity, its multiple niches and sarcophagi and blocked passages, created disorientation, broke up direct route, forced navigators to choose paths and confront barriers, tested determination and commitment before permitting access to Chamber I below. Chamber I's flooded condition added physical challenge to symbolic journey, required wading through water, demanded that participants literally immerse themselves in element representing chaos from which creation emerged, forced bodily engagement with transformation rather than mere intellectual understanding. The darkness, the confined space, the water, the massive sarcophagus, all combined to create environment radically different from surface world, environment that human psychology responds to with altered consciousness, with heightened attention, with openness to experiences that normal settings don't facilitate. Sensory deprivation research has demonstrated that humans placed in dark, quiet, isolated environments experience profound psychological changes, hallucinate, encounter visions, undergo alterations of consciousness that they often interpret as spiritual experiences. Chamber I provided exactly such conditions, darkness broken only by oil lamps that created flickering shadows, silence magnified by underground isolation, water surrounding platform creating acoustic properties that distorted sound, temperature maintained at constant cool that differed noticeably from surface heat. Participants descending into this environment would experience physiological responses that their culture interpreted through Osiris mythology, that their training prepared them to understand as journey through underworld, that their beliefs transformed into genuine encounters with divine powers. If rituals in Chamber I incorporated periods of immobilization in the sarcophagus, if initiates were sealed in darkness within the granite coffin while priests performed ceremonies around them, if the experience lasted hours or days producing extended sensory deprivation combined with physical confinement and psychological stress, then the transformation participants reported would be genuine even if explanations they gave were culturally conditioned interpretations of universal human responses to such extreme conditions. The Osiris Shaft wouldn't be merely symbolic representation but rather functional technology for inducing altered consciousness, for producing initiatory experiences, for facilitating transformations that Egyptian religious thought described as dying and being reborn but that modern psychology might describe as profound personality reorganization or consciousness expansion. This interpretation explains features that purely symbolic reading struggles to account for: the enormous investment in excavating 30 meters into bedrock, the sophisticated engineering ensuring Chamber I remained permanently flooded, the blocking of eastern passage suggesting restriction of access, the absence of inscriptions indicating secrecy around actual practices, the empty sarcophagus demonstrating it wasn't burial equipment but rather ritual tool. If the Osiris Shaft served initiatory rather than funerary purposes, if it functioned as mystery school rather than tomb, if it preserved practical knowledge about consciousness transformation encoded in architectural metaphor, then its significance extended far beyond religious symbolism and into realms of actual technique, actual practice, actual methodology for achieving states that Egyptian wisdom literature described but that modern cultures have largely lost access to because the knowledge was encoded in structures we can't enter and in texts we interpret literally rather than understanding as instructions for replicable experiences. And perhaps that's why the shaft remains closed to public access, why investigation beyond preliminary excavation hasn't been permitted, why authorities restrict who can descend into chambers that Horus documented but didn't fully explore. If the Osiris Shaft contains evidence of techniques for consciousness alteration, if its design incorporates principles that modern understanding of psychology and neuroscience would recognize as effective methodology, if it demonstrates that ancient Egyptians possessed practical knowledge about human consciousness that contemporary cultures have forgotten, then complete investigation might reveal capabilities that challenge assumptions about technological progress that suggest ancient wisdom achieved through different means what modern science struggles to accomplish through chemical and electronic intervention, that prove that the ancients understood something profound about human potential that modern cultures with all their technology have yet to rediscover because we approach ancient structures as tombs rather than laboratories, as religious artifacts rather than functional equipment, as symbols rather than instructions waiting to be properly decoded and cautiously implemented by those willing to descend into darkness, to immerse in chaos waters, to lie in granite coffins while experiencing whatever transformation the Osiris Shaft was designed to facilitate for initiates who proved worthy through determination to reach depths where ordinary consciousness ended and something profoundly different began. The chronological confusion surrounding the Osiris Shaft represents one of archaeology's most frustrating puzzles, creates situation where evidence points in multiple contradictory directions, produces conclusions that depend entirely on which artifacts receive priority in interpretation. Dr. Horus, based on pottery fragments recovered from Shaft C and Chamber I, dated the complex to Egypt's 6th dynasty, approximately 2345 to 2181 BC. Placing construction during Old Kingdom's later period when pyramid building had already passed its peak but royal authority remained strong enough to command major construction projects. The pottery evidence seemed straightforward, consisted of sherds showing stylistic characteristics matching known 6th dynasty ceramics, displayed manufacturing techniques and decorative patterns consistent with that period's archaeological assemblages. Pottery dating is reliable methodology when fragments can be matched to well-documented sequences, when stylistic evolution is understood sufficiently that experts can assign ceramics to narrow chronological ranges, when context suggests artifacts reflect construction period rather than later intrusions. The 6th dynasty dating would make the Osiris Shaft roughly contemporary with PPI's reign, would place it during period when royal tomb architecture was shifting from massive pyramids to smaller but more elaborately decorated structures. But the granite sarcophagi told dramatically different story, showed stylistic features and manufacturing characteristics inconsistent with Old Kingdom work, matched instead the aesthetic and technical standards of 26th dynasty approximately 664 to 525 BC during Egypt's late period more than 1500 years after pottery evidence suggested initial construction. The sarcophagi's proportions, their corner treatments, their lid designs, their surface finishing, all matched 26th dynasty examples rather than Old Kingdom prototypes, created chronological gap that conventional interpretation struggled to explain satisfactorily. The standard resolution proposed that the shaft complex had been excavated during 6th dynasty but remained unfinished or was used for purposes that didn't require sarcophagi until 26th dynasty discovered the ancient chambers and adapted them for contemporary burial practices, installed coffins manufactured in their own period, repurposed spaces whose original functions were forgotten or irrelevant to their needs. This interpretation preserved both pottery and sarcophagus dating, reconciled contradictory evidence through assuming complex construction history involving initial excavation followed by later modification and reuse. But this resolution raised as many questions as it answered, created new puzzles while solving old ones, forced assumptions that evidence didn't directly support. If 6th dynasty builders excavated 30 meters of shafts and chambers, invested enormous resources in creating elaborate three-level complex, why leave it without the sarcophagi that burial function seemingly required? Why excavate chamber I with its central platform obviously designed to support massive coffin but not install that coffin for 15 centuries? Why create architectural ensemble whose symbolic completeness demanded central sarcophagus yet defer that element until later period rediscovered the complex and filled the obvious gap? Alternative interpretation suggested the shaft was far older than either pottery or sarcophagi indicated, that it predated Egyptian dynastic civilization entirely, that both 6th dynasty pottery and 26th dynasty sarcophagi represented intrusions into pre-existing structure whose actual construction date remained unknown because original builders left no datable artifacts or inscriptions revealing when excavation occurred. This interpretation aligned with growing evidence that the Giza plateau had been sacred ground for cultures predating pharaonic Egypt, that monuments like the Sphinx showed geological weathering inconsistent with conventional dating, that underground structures throughout the region demonstrated engineering sophistication suggesting knowledge inherited from earlier periods rather than developed during dynasties whose capabilities are well documented. The absence of inscriptions throughout the Osiris Shaft complex supported this alternative chronology, suggested that whoever excavated the chambers operated under different conventions than dynastic Egyptians whose burial practices demanded extensive textual coverage of tomb walls, whose religious requirements included hieroglyphic spells protecting deceased and guiding them through afterlife, whose cultural practices made anonymous tombs virtually non-existent. Every known 6th dynasty burial included inscriptions identifying the deceased, invoking protective deities, providing guidance for navigating underworld challenges. The Osiris Shaft's complete lack of such texts suggested either that it predated the tradition of inscribed tombs or that it served purposes that didn't require or didn't permit the textual element standard burials incorporated. The comparison to other Giza structures strengthened the case for greater antiquity beyond what pottery evidence suggested. The Sphinx, based on Dr. Robert Schoch's geological analysis of water erosion patterns, predated conventional 4th dynasty dating by thousands of years, possibly extending back to 10,000 BC or earlier when the Sahara received sufficient rainfall to produce weathering patterns visible on the monument's flanks. If the Sphinx was that ancient, if it marked sacred site used by pre-dynastic cultures, if the entire Giza complex incorporated elements from periods far earlier than orthodox archaeology admitted, then the Osiris Shaft might similarly predate conventional chronology, might represent construction by people about whom dynastic Egyptians preserved only mythological memories, might belong to civilization whose achievements later periods could admire but not replicate. The engineering capabilities demonstrated by the Osiris Shaft's construction exceeded what should have been possible using copper tools and rope that 6th dynasty supposedly possessed, raised questions about methodology that conventional tool explanations struggle to address. Excavating 30 meters of vertical shafts through solid limestone, creating chambers with dimensions requiring removal of hundreds of cubic meters of rock, positioning multi-ton granite sarcophagi in spaces accessible only through narrow passages, all suggested either that ancient builders possessed techniques modern archaeology underestimates or that construction occurred during period when more advanced capabilities existed than conventional chronology allows. The water management engineering implicit in Chamber I's design provided additional evidence suggesting capabilities beyond what 6th dynasty supposedly commanded. Creating chamber at precise depth where groundwater would naturally accumulate required understanding hydrology, required surveying underground aquifers, required calculating water table levels with accuracy that presupposed knowledge of geological principles that formal science wouldn't articulate until modern period. If ancient builders possessed such knowledge, if they could engineer spaces that self-maintained through natural processes, if they understood subsurface geology sufficiently to predict where water would accumulate and exploit that for architectural purposes, then attributing construction to period when such knowledge supposedly didn't exist becomes problematic. The pottery sherds that provided 6th dynasty dating might not represent construction period but rather later use, might indicate that dynastic Egyptians discovered pre-existing chambers and adapted them for contemporary purposes, might reflect activity occurring millennia after original excavation by builders whose artifacts either didn't survive or consisted of materials that decay wouldn't preserve across vast time spans. Organic materials like wood, rope, leather, cloth, all deteriorate completely given sufficient time, leave no traces that archaeologists can recover, ensure that civilizations using primarily organic technology vanish from archaeological record despite having been sophisticated and capable. If pre-dynastic builders used wooden scaffolding, rope lifting systems, leather water bags, cloth for various purposes, their presence in the Osiris Shaft would leave no evidence surviving to modern excavation except perhaps tool marks on stone showing copper or bronze implements were used for finishing work even if primary excavation employed different methods. The absence of stone tools, the lack of construction debris, the clean emptiness of all chambers, all suggested either that builders meticulously cleaned after themselves or that time had removed everything except durable stone elements, leaving complex whose age couldn't be determined from artifacts because artifacts that would enable dating simply didn't survive. The 26th dynasty sarcophagi, rather than indicating when chambers were first used, might represent final phase of long history spanning millennia, might show late-period Egyptians discovering ancient chambers and installing contemporary burial equipment in spaces they recognized as sacred but whose original purposes they no longer understood. The blocking of the Eastern Passage might have occurred during this period, might represent late-period decision to seal connections to other underground structures, might reflect religious or political motivations that made maintaining access to broader network undesirable for authorities who wanted to control how sacred sites were used. The dating controversy ultimately reflects larger problems in Egyptian chronology, demonstrates how assumptions shape interpretation, reveals that evidence can support multiple contradictory conclusions depending on which artifacts receive priority and which get dismissed as secondary intrusions. Orthodox archaeology insists on 6th dynasty dating because pottery provides clear evidence and institutional inertia favors conventional chronologies over radical revisions. Alternative researchers argue for far greater antiquity because engineering capabilities and the absence of inscriptions suggest pre-dynastic construction that pottery sherds don't adequately contradict because later use of ancient structures is well documented throughout Egyptian archaeology. The truth likely lies somewhere between extremes, involves construction history more complex than either simple 6th dynasty excavation or pure pre-dynastic origin allows, suggests that the Osiris Shaft evolved over millennia through multiple phases of use, modification, abandonment, and rediscovery by successive cultures who adapted the complex for their own purposes while never fully understanding what original builders intended. The pottery indicates 6th dynasty presence, the sarcophagi confirm late-period activity, but the engineering and the lack of inscriptions suggest origins extending beyond what either artifact category directly proves. Origins that might remain mysterious because the people who excavated 30 meters into bedrock beneath the Giza plateau didn't leave the sorts of evidence that later cultures would consider necessary for proper construction, didn't operate under conventions that later periods assumed were universal, didn't create monuments whose dates could be easily determined because they either predated or transcended the archaeological methodologies that conventional chronology depends on for establishing when structures were built, when chambers were excavated, when the journey into depths beneath the plateau first began in periods so remote that even Egyptian tradition preserved only mythological memories calling them the first time when gods walked the earth and created monuments that later generations would inherit, would use, would modify, but would never entirely understand because knowledge of origins had been lost across time spans exceeding what written records preserved, exceeding what pottery sherds documented, exceeding what anything except patient stone remembered from ages when the world was young and civilizations now forgotten carved passages descending toward underworlds both literal and symbolic, both physical and metaphysical, both destinations for the dead and laboratories for the living. Who sought transformation in depths where dating becomes uncertain, where chronology dissolves into mystery, where the Osiris Shaft guards secrets about its own age as carefully as it guards whatever other secrets 3 levels of chambers still conceal. The artifacts recovered from the Osiris Shaft during Hawassa's 1999 excavation represented archaeological puzzle, created more questions than answers, produced evidence that conventional interpretation struggled to synthesize into coherent narrative. Human bones, pottery shards, fragments of stone and metal, scattered debris from multiple time periods, all mixed together in deposits suggesting the complex had been used, reused, disturbed, and abandoned across millennia of occupation by successive cultures who left their traces without creating comprehensive record explaining who they were or what they did in chambers 30 meters below the Giza plateau. The human remains found in Level 2's niches consisted of fragmentary bones, incomplete skeletal elements showing no anatomical organization, scattered pieces rather than properly buried bodies. The bones showed no signs of mummification, lacked the careful preservation that Egyptian burial practices demanded, suggested either that bodies had been placed in the shaft without proper funerary treatment or that time and water had destroyed whatever preservation efforts had been attempted. The absence of complete skeletons, the random distribution of bone fragments, the lack of associated burial goods beyond basic pottery, all indicated that whatever happened to these people differed dramatically from standard Egyptian burial customs. DNA analysis of recovered bone fragments might have revealed genetic relationships, might have determined whether all remains came from single family line or represented diverse individuals from different periods, might have connected these bones to other ancient Egyptian populations whose genetic profiles are documented. But such analysis apparently wasn't conducted, wasn't reported in published excavation accounts, wasn't made available for independent researchers seeking to understand who these people were and why their remains ended up scattered through chambers that showed no other evidence of serving burial function. The absence of DNA studies seemed conspicuous, seemed like missed opportunity for resolving mysteries, seemed possibly like deliberate decision not to pursue investigations that might produce uncomfortable results. The pottery fragments provided chronological markers but created as much confusion as clarification, showed stylistic characteristics spanning millennia from Old Kingdom through Late Period and possibly beyond, demonstrated that multiple cultures had accessed the shaft complex and left their ceramics without explaining why they came or what they did once they arrived. Some sherds matched 6th dynasty assemblages, supported Hawassa's proposed construction date, indicated that earliest documented activity in the shaft corresponded to Old Kingdom's later period when royal power remained sufficient to command major construction projects but pyramid building had already passed its peak. Other pottery fragments showed late period characteristics, matched 26th dynasty styles contemporary with the granite sarcophagi installed in levels 2 and 3, confirmed that significant activity occurred 1500 years after initial construction when late-period Egyptians rediscovered ancient chambers and adapted them for purposes that ceramic evidence alone couldn't determine. Still other sherds didn't match any well-documented period, showed manufacturing techniques or decorative patterns that archaeological databases couldn't place within established chronological sequences, suggested either that unrecorded ceramic traditions existed or that some pottery predated or postdated periods whose characteristics are thoroughly documented. The complete absence of inscriptions throughout all 3 levels violated every convention of Egyptian tomb architecture, created situation unprecedented in documented archaeological sites, demanded explanation that conventional burial interpretation couldn't provide. Every known Egyptian tomb from every period included texts, from simple name inscriptions identifying the deceased to elaborate religious compositions covering walls with spells and guidance, from brief offering formulas to complete copies of underworld books like the Amduat or the Book of Gates. The inscriptions weren't optional, weren't aesthetic choices, were religious necessities ensuring deceased received proper protection and knowledge enabling successful navigation of afterlife challenges. The Osiris Shaft's anonymous chambers suggested either that it predated the tradition of inscribed tombs, that it belonged to period when Egyptian religious practices didn't yet include textual elements that later became essential, or that it served purposes that didn't require or didn't permit the inscription standard burials demanded. If the shaft predated inscribed tomb tradition, if it was excavated before hieroglyphic writing had developed sufficiently complex religious literature, then it belonged to period far earlier than 6th dynasty pottery suggested, belonged potentially to pre-dynastic or even pre-literate periods when Egyptian civilization was just emerging from whatever preceded it. Alternatively, the absence of inscriptions might reflect deliberate secrecy, might indicate that activities in the shaft weren't meant to be documented, might suggest that knowledge transmitted here was restricted to oral tradition deliberately not recorded in permanent form. Mystery religions throughout ancient Mediterranean world maintained secrecy partly through refusing to write down core teachings, through restricting knowledge to initiates who underwent experiences that couldn't be adequately communicated through text, through creating traditions that survived across generations through careful oral transmission rather than through written records that non-initiates might access. If the Osiris Shaft served initiatory rather than funerary purposes, if it facilitated transformation experiences that initiates underwent but weren't supposed to discuss with outsiders, if it preserved practical knowledge about consciousness alteration that priests considered too dangerous or too sacred to commit to writing, then absence of inscriptions made perfect sense. The chambers themselves encoded knowledge through architecture, through spatial relationships, through experiences that descending the shafts and entering the flooded chamber produced in participants who underwent properly guided ritual processes. The knowledge was experimental rather than textual, was transmitted through practice rather than description, couldn't be stolen by reading walls because walls remained deliberately blank. The fragmentary metal objects recovered from various levels included copper tools showing wear patterns consistent with stone carving, bronze implements whose alloy composition matched late-period manufacturing standards, and small pieces of gold and silver whose purposes couldn't be determined from surviving fragments. The metal artifacts supported chronological span indicated by pottery, confirmed that shafts or activity across millennia, demonstrated that multiple cultures using different metallurgical technologies had accessed the chambers and left their tools without creating comprehensive archaeological deposits that would enable reconstruction of detailed activity sequences. The stone fragments included pieces of limestone showing tool marks, granite chips probably from sarcophagus installation or maintenance, and worked stones whose original positions couldn't be determined from surviving pieces. The absence of construction debris, the lack of stone dust and chips that excavation work inevitably produces, the clean condition of all chambers, all suggested either that builders meticulously cleaned after themselves or that later occupants removed earlier deposits leaving spaces empty except for materials that accumulating over final periods of use when maintenance ceased and abandonment began. Most puzzling was what wasn't found despite expectations that such materials should be present if the shaft served any of the purposes that conventional interpretation proposed. No funerary equipment beyond the empty sarcophagi, no canopic jars for organ preservation, no sharpty figures serving deceased in afterlife, no amulets providing magical protection, no food offerings sustaining soul during transformation, no furniture accompanying occupant to next world, no religious texts guiding navigation through underworld challenges. The shaft contained none of the standard burial goods that every documented Egyptian tomb included regardless of occupant status or period when interment occurred. The absence was complete, was absolute, was so thorough that it forced conclusion that conventional burial interpretation couldn't be correct, that the shaft served different purposes than standard tombs, that its function didn't require or didn't permit the materials Egyptian funerary practice considered essential. If not burial, then what? The empty sarcophagi suggested symbolic rather than functional use, indicated that coffins served ritual purposes rather than actually containing bodies, implied that descent into the shaft culminated in experiences that didn't involve permanent interment but rather temporary containment followed by emergence transformed through whatever occurred in flooded darkness 30 meters below surface. The blocked eastern passage at level 2, that corridor filled with massive sarcophagus preventing access to spaces beyond, added another mystery to already puzzling artifact assemblage. What lay beyond the blockage that someone considered important enough to seal using valuable burial equipment as barrier? preliminary investigations suggested the passage continued toward the Sphinx, suggested connections to chambers detected by radar beneath the Guardian Monument, suggested that the Osiris Shaft represented a node in underground network extending across the plateau connecting different monuments through subterranean routes that surface observation couldn't detect. But investigation of the blocked passage apparently wasn't pursued, wasn't documented in published accounts, wasn't followed up through excavation that would determine whether the corridor actually reached the Sphinx or dead-ended after short distance. The absence of published research about Eastern Passage seemed conspicuous, seemed like missed opportunity for resolving one of the shaft's most intriguing mysteries, seemed possibly like deliberate decision not to pursue investigations that might reveal connections authorities preferred remain undocumented, that might demonstrate underground network existed, that might prove ancient builders had created integrated systems spanning entire plateau rather than isolated structures that conventional archaeology found comfortable to explain. The missing records, the unpublished findings, the research that apparently occurred but whose results never reached public discourse, all created situation where more was known about the Osiris Shaft than official publications acknowledged, where excavators possessed information they hadn't shared, where understanding of the complex remained incomplete not because evidence didn't exist but because sharing it apparently wasn't permitted or wasn't considered advisable for reasons never explicitly stated but that could be inferred from patterns of suppression characterizing research throughout Giza's underground structures where discovery consistently preceded denial, where confirmation triggered classification, where evidence demanded further investigation that authorities consistently refused to authorize despite technology capable of resolution, despite questions demanding answers. Despite mysteries that physical access and proper documentation could resolve if anyone with authority decided that solving mysteries mattered more than protecting whatever secrets 3 levels of chambers still contained beneath causeway connecting Khafra's pyramid to structures on plateau's edge where Sphinx watched, where Valley Temple stood, where blocked passage suggested connections that might explain why artifacts told incomplete stories, why records went missing, why the Osiris Shafts deepest mysteries remained protected not just by stone and water but by human decisions ensuring certain questions wouldn't be asked, certain investigations wouldn't proceed, certain truths would remain buried in darkness beneath the Giza plateau where patience measured in millennia waited for circumstances that might finally allow complete disclosure of what fragmentary artifacts hinted at, what missing records concealed, what the empty chambers still guarded despite excavation having penetrated 30 meters into their depths without finding comprehensive answers to questions that human bones and pottery shards only partially addressed while leaving fundamental mysteries unsolved. The engineering challenge of clearing chamber I dominated the 1999 excavation, required weeks of continuous pumping, consumed enormous resources, demonstrated that controlling water at 30-meter depth presented difficulties that ancient builders had somehow overcome or deliberately incorporated into the complex's design. Ismail Osman's industrial pumps ran 24 hours daily, moved hundreds of gallons per minute upward through the narrow shafts, discharged onto the plateau surface where it evaporated under the Egyptian sun or was channeled away to prevent flooding adjacent areas. The pumping operation revealed the water's remarkable clarity, demonstrated purity inconsistent with stagnant underground pool, suggested circulation that prevented bacterial growth despite chamber I's sealed condition. Horace described water clean enough to see through completely, pure enough to drink safely, maintained at quality suggesting active flow rather than static accumulation. The clarity indicated connections to larger aquifer systems, implied underground channels moving groundwater across the plateau, demonstrated that chamber I wasn't isolated reservoir but node in network of underground water features. As pumps lowered water levels revealing the central platform and its massive sarcophagus, excitement built among excavation team expecting discoveries that would justify effort and expense. But excitement transformed into disappointment when sarcophagus proved empty, when no burial goods materialized, when chamber yielded only fragmentary artifacts insufficient for conclusive interpretation. The disappointment was palpable, was shared by everyone who had invested resources hoping for treasure, was magnified by realization that effort had produced more questions than answers. The pumping operation's most troubling revelation came after work ceased, after pumps were removed, after excavation team departed, leaving chambers supposedly dry and accessible for future study. Within weeks, water returned, refilled chamber I to previous levels, demonstrated that removing it was temporary achievement dependent on continuous mechanical intervention rather than permanent solution. The water's return wasn't gradual seepage but relatively rapid refilling, suggesting strong groundwater sources, indicating substantial hydraulic pressure, demonstrating that chamber I existed at depth where aquifer systems naturally maintained flooding regardless of human attempts to create dry conditions. The rapid refilling raised questions about how ancient users accessed the chamber, about whether they worked in perpetually flooded conditions, about whether water's presence served functional purposes rather than being obstacle to overcome. If ancient priests performed rituals in chamber I, if initiates descended for transformative experiences, did they wade through water that reached their waists or chests? Did they dive beneath surface to reach the sarcophagus? Did ceremonies incorporate immersion as essential element? The water wasn't inconvenience but rather feature, wasn't problem but rather solution, wasn't obstacle but rather tool serving purposes that interpretation focused on burial function couldn't adequately explain. The engineering implied by deliberately flooding chamber I exceeded what conventional assessment of ancient Egyptian capabilities typically acknowledged. Creating chamber at precise depth where groundwater would naturally accumulate required understanding hydrology, required surveying underground aquifer distributions, required calculating water table levels with accuracy, presupposing geological knowledge that formal science wouldn't develop until modern period. If builders possessed such understanding, if they engineered self-maintaining water feature that functioned automatically through natural processes, they demonstrated capabilities that conventional chronology associated with periods supposedly lacking such sophistication. Alternative interpretation suggested chamber's depth wasn't determined by desire to reach specific bedrock layer but rather by need to position platform at level where water would surround it, where flooding would create island-matching Osiris mythology, where hydraulic conditions would serve ritual purposes requiring water presence. The 30-meter excavation wasn't unnecessarily deep but rather precisely calculated to reach depth where natural processes would maintain desired water levels without requiring mechanical systems that might fail across centuries of use. The builders created sustainable design that geological processes maintained, that required no human intervention, preserving function, that demonstrated understanding of how to harness natural forces for architectural purposes. The self-maintaining character of chamber I's flooding suggested another possibility, implied that builders anticipated periods when human maintenance wouldn't occur, when access might be restricted or prevented, when chamber needed to protect itself through environmental conditions that unauthorized persons couldn't easily overcome. The water served security function, prevented casual exploration, created barrier that required significant resources and determination to breach, ensured that whatever chamber I contained remained protected even during periods when priests no longer maintained active watch, when knowledge of proper access methods was lost, when civilization that built the shaft had passed into history, leaving only flooded chambers that later cultures would discover but struggle to interpret. Modern investigation faced choices ancient users hadn't confronted, needed to decide whether understanding required removing water or whether water's presence revealed something essential about function. Horus chose pumping, chose creating dry conditions enabling examination of sarcophagus and platform, chose temporary transformation of environment that builders had carefully engineered to remain flooded. The choice produced photographs, enabled measurements, permitted documentation that wouldn't have been possible underwater, achieved goals that conventional archaeology valued above preserving original conditions. But the choice also destroyed whatever evidence water's presence might have provided, eliminated possibility of studying how rituals functioned in flooded environment, prevented investigation of whether specific water depths or flow patterns served purposes that emptying eliminated. The pumping operation was archaeological success but interpretive failure, was technical achievement that hindered understanding, was intervention that transformed rather than merely documenting what ancient builders had created, was modern imposition of dry preferences onto architecture deliberately designed to remain wet. The water's inevitable return demonstrated that chamber I resisted modern intervention, that geological processes were stronger than temporary pumping, that nature reclaimed what engineering had created for nature to maintain. The chamber refilled, restored itself to designed condition, returned to state that builders had intended, defeated human attempt at permanent alteration through sheer persistence of aquifer pressure that no amount of pumping could permanently overcome without continuous mechanical intervention that Egyptian authorities apparently didn't consider worth maintaining. The self-restoring character created practical obstacle for anyone wanting regular access to chamber I, ensured that visiting required either underwater capability or pumping resources that few possessed, guaranteed that chamber remained protected through natural processes that ancient engineering had harnessed for security purposes that still functioned millennia after builders disappeared. The water guarded the shaft more effectively than locks or seals, more reliably than human guards, more permanently than any mechanical security system, protected through geological processes that couldn't be defeated except temporarily, that returned whenever intervention ceased, that ensured chamber I's secrets remained submerged in darkness where Herodotus had described them, where Horace had found them, where they wait still beneath water that returned once pumps stopped, water that fills the chamber today as completely as when ancient priests last descended 30 meters into depths where transformation occurred, where Osiris's power manifested, where mysteries were experienced rather than merely discussed, where water surrounding platform created conditions that conventional interpretation struggles to explain but that alternative theories increasingly suggest served purposes more sophisticated than simple burial, more functional than pure symbolism, more deliberately engineered than conventional assessments of ancient capabilities want to admit. Purposes that water's persistent presence continues to serve by making chamber inaccessible except to those willing to invest resources that modern investigation apparently considers unjustified given that preliminary work revealed no treasure beyond empty sarcophagus and fragmentary artifacts insufficient to satisfy expectations shaped by decades of spectacular tomb discoveries elsewhere in Egypt where gold and mummies rewarded excavators whose successes made Osiris Shaft's emptiness seem disappointing rather than revealing, seem failure rather than clue, seem absence rather than presence of something invisible to approaches that couldn't recognize what filled the chamber more substantially than any burial goods, water, maintaining itself, protecting continuously, demonstrating through sheer persistence that what ancient engineers created still functions exactly as designed despite modern inability to understand why flooding serves purposes worth the enormous effort required to excavate 30 meters specifically to reach depth where groundwater would naturally accumulate and maintain conditions that refilling after temporary pumping proved remain active, remain effective, remain protecting whatever secrets empty chambers and patient water still guard in depths beneath causeway where discovery vindicated Herodotus, where investigation raised more questions than answers, where water's return after pumping demonstrated that some features resist modern intervention. Because they were designed to function automatically, permanently, independently of human maintenance across timescales exceeding what civilizations typically survive. The eastern passage at level 2, that corridor blocked by massive granite sarcophagus positioned deliberately to prevent access to spaces beyond, represents one of the Osiris Shaft's most tantalizing features, the architectural element that most strongly suggests connections extending beyond the 30 meters excavation reached. The passage runs eastward from level 2's main chamber, oriented directly toward the Sphinx and Valley Temple, follows trajectory that if extended would pass beneath Khafra's causeway and potentially reach chambers that radar surveys have detected beneath the Guardian Monument watching over the plateau. The sarcophagus blocking the corridor wasn't placed casually, wasn't stored conveniently in space that happened to obstruct passage, showed deliberate positioning suggesting intention to permanently close route connecting different parts of underground system. The granite coffin fills the opening completely, wedges tightly against walls, creates barrier that can't be removed without major excavation effort, risking damage to both sarcophagus and passage architecture. Whoever blocked the corridor committed valuable burial equipment to security function, sacrificed coffin that could have served religious purposes to ensure passage remained inaccessible. The deliberate nature of blocking raises immediate question: what lay beyond that warranted such effort to prevent access? If passage simply dead-ended after short distance, if it led nowhere significant, why bother sealing it so thoroughly? The effort implied that corridor connected to something, accessed spaces that authorities wanted separated from Osiris Shaft proper, led to chambers that weren't meant to be reached through this route regardless of who might descend the shafts attempting to explore. Preliminary investigations conducted during 1999 excavation apparently detected voids beyond the blocked passage, suggested continuation of corridor extending past immediate obstacle, indicated that passage didn't terminate at blocking point but rather continued toward eastern destinations that radar couldn't map without excavation. The detection created expectations that follow-up investigation would determine whether passage actually reached the Sphinx, would map its full extent, would discover what connections it maintained to other underground structures. But follow-up didn't occur, wasn't documented in published accounts, wasn't pursued through excavation that would resolve mysteries the blocked passage presented. The absence of published research seemed conspicuous, seemed like missed opportunity for answering one of the shaft's most compelling questions, seemed possibly like deliberate decision not to investigate features that might reveal uncomfortable truths about underground network extent, about connections between monuments, about integrated systems spanning the plateau that conventional archaeology preferred not acknowledging. The orientation toward the Sphinx wasn't arbitrary, reflected planning that coordinated underground passages with surface monuments, demonstrated that builders understood spatial relationships spanning hundreds of meters, possessed surveying capabilities ensuring passages reached intended destinations despite excavating through solid bedrock where visual reference points didn't exist. If passage actually connected Osiris Shaft to chambers beneath Sphinx, if it formed one element of larger network linking different monuments, then blocking represented decision to sever that network, to prevent movement between sites that original design had integrated into unified system. The timing of blocking remained uncertain, depended on dating the sarcophagus installation, couldn't be determined without excavating beyond barrier to examine passage continuation for artifacts or features indicating when closure occurred. The 26th dynasty stylistic characteristics of blocking sarcophagus suggested late-period decision, approximately 664 to 525 BC, more than 1500 years after pottery evidence indicated initial shaft construction during 6th dynasty. The gap implied long history of use followed by eventual decision that maintaining eastern connection had become undesirable or dangerous, that political or religious circumstances made sealing passage preferable to allowing continued access. Alternative interpretation suggested blocking occurred during Ptolemaic period when Greek rulers consolidated control over Egyptian religious institutions, when foreign authorities discovered underground networks and decided that closing connections served their interests better than maintaining systems they didn't fully understand. Ptolemaic Egypt saw systematic suppression of certain ancient practices, deliberate closure of sacred sites, intentional severing of connections between temples and monuments that earlier periods had maintained. The blocked eastern passage might represent one element of this broader pattern, one connection that foreign rulers chose to permanently close. The blocked passage also raised questions about what modern authorities knew regarding underground connections, about whether investigations beyond public disclosure had occurred, about whether the same pattern of suppression characterizing research throughout Giza also applied to exploring corridors at level 2. The absence of radar surveys mapping eastern passage extent, the lack of published research about where corridor led, the silence about whether connections to Sphinx chambers actually existed, all suggested either that investigation hadn't been permitted or that results were classified preventing public disclosure. The 2025 Italian discoveries detecting massive underground structures beneath the plateau, those 8 vertical shafts descending 650 meters with cubic chambers at their bases, strengthened interpretation that Osiris Shaft represented merely one visible element of far more extensive infrastructure. If underground network connected different monuments through passages at multiple depths, if 30-meter excavation barely scratched surface of what existed below, if deeper shafts descended hundreds of meters into structures conventional archaeology insisted couldn't exist, then blocked eastern passage might connect not just to Sphinx chambers but to deeper levels that no modern investigation had successfully reached. The strategic importance of controlling access to such network would explain blocking, would justify using valuable sarcophagus as barrier, would account for absence of documentation about when or why closure occurred. If passages connected monuments whose symbolic and religious significance was enormous, if they provided routes that initiates could use accessing multiple sacred sites without surface observation, if they contained spaces where rituals or knowledge transmission occurred, then maintaining security meant ensuring unauthorized persons couldn't navigate network, couldn't discover connections between sites, couldn't access chambers meant to remain restricted. The blocked passage thus represented both archaeological mystery and security feature, both evidence of ancient connectivity and demonstration of ancient access control, both tantalizing suggestion of what might lie beyond and frustrating obstacle preventing modern investigation from determining what actually existed in spaces the sarcophagus protected through granite permanence that ensured Eastern Corridor's secrets would remain hidden unless someone with authority decided removal was justified, unless circumstances changed sufficiently that exploring beyond blockage became permitted, unless priorities shifted from protecting whatever lay beyond to discovering what passage connected to and what purposes those connections served in system that ancient builders created but that modern suppression apparently considered too sensitive to fully explore. The fundamental question that has haunted researchers since Horus first descended into the flooded chambers, the question that burns through all conventional explanations, the mystery that refuses to fade despite official interpretations insisting the shaft was merely symbolic tomb, centers on a simple but profound issue. Why excavate 30 meters into solid bedrock to create empty chambers that violate every convention of Egyptian burial practice? The effort was enormous, the resources were substantial, the engineering required capabilities that pushed ancient technology to its limits, yet the result was structure containing no mummies, no treasure, no inscriptions, nothing that standard tomb interpretation would predict. The answer, whispered among alternative researchers, suggested in ancient texts, encoded in the architecture itself, points toward purposes that transcended simple burial, that involved functions modern archaeology struggles to categorize, that reflected understanding of consciousness and transformation that later periods either lost or deliberately suppressed. The Osiris Shaft wasn't tomb but gateway, wasn't burial chamber but initiatory space, wasn't monument to death but laboratory for transformation where living persons underwent experiences that Egyptian tradition described as dying and being reborn, as passing through Osiris's realm, as achieving states of consciousness that ordinary existence couldn't access. The architecture supported this interpretation more convincingly than burial hypothesis could explain. The 3-level descent replicated journey into underworld, enacted separation from surface world, created progressive stages matching initiatory sequences documented across ancient mystery religions. Chamber A served as preparation space, transition zone where mundane consciousness released its grip. Level 2's complexity-tested determination, forced choices about which passages to follow, created disorientation that broke habitual mental patterns. Chamber I provided culmination, the flooded space where transformation occurred through immersion, sensory deprivation, symbolic death in granite sarcophagus positioned on island surrounded by chaos waters. The water's presence wasn't obstacle but essential element, wasn't engineering failure but deliberate design feature serving purposes that required flooding. Ancient traditions worldwide associated water with purification, with transition between states, with boundaries separating different realms of existence. Immersion marked transformations, enabled passages from one condition to another, provided element that symbolized both death and birth, that dissolved old forms while enabling new ones to emerge. Chamber I's self-maintaining flood created permanent initiatory environment, ensured that transformation rituals could occur across centuries without requiring human maintenance of water levels. The empty sarcophagus testified to function, proved that chamber served living rather than dead, demonstrated that architecture designed around temporary containment rather than permanent burial. Initiates would lie in granite coffin experiencing symbolic death while priests performed rituals around them, would remain immobile in darkness while sensory deprivation and psychological stress produced altered consciousness, would emerge transformed having access states that Egyptians associated with Osiris's power, with underworld knowledge, with mysteries that separated initiates from ordinary persons through experiences rather than merely through teaching. The blocked eastern passage suggested connections to larger system, indicated that Osiris Shaft was node in network spanning the plateau, implied that initiatory sequence might involve multiple sites accessed through underground routes that surface observation couldn't detect. If transformation required presence at different monuments, if rituals incorporated elements from sphinx and pyramids and labyrinth and other sacred structures, if the journey through mysteries involved physical movement between underground chambers located beneath different surface features, then passages connecting those chambers served essential function enabling initiates to complete sequences that individual sites alone couldn't provide. The dating controversy, that 1500-year gap between 6th dynasty pottery and 26th dynasty sarcophagi, suggested long history of use spanning multiple periods when different cultures adapted ancient facility for contemporary purposes without fully understanding original intent. The shaft might predate both artifact categories, might belong to pre-dynastic civilization that carved chambers before Egyptian tradition developed burial customs that later periods assumed were universal, might represent inheritance from ages when different religious practices guided construction of underground structures serving purposes that later cultures interpreted through frameworks of their own traditions. The 2025 context added urgency to understanding Osiris Shaft's significance, connected it to broader pattern of underground discoveries at Giza, demonstrated that 30-meter excavation barely scratched surface of infrastructure extending hundreds of meters into plateau's depths. The Italian team's detection of 8 vertical shafts reaching 650 meters, those massive structures with cubic chambers at their bases, suggested Osiris Shaft represented accessible portion of far more extensive system, visible node of network that extended beyond what conventional archaeology had documented or orthodox chronology could explain. If deeper shafts existed, if they predated Egyptian civilization by millennia, if they represented engineering achievements of cultures about which history preserved only mythological memories, then the Osiris Shaft's mysteries extended beyond individual structure to encompass questions about human origins, about technological development, about civilizations that rose and fell before recorded history began. The shaft wasn't isolated monument but rather surface manifestation of deeper truths, gateway not just to underworld in religious sense but to understanding of human past that current narratives couldn't accommodate. And perhaps that's why investigation remained restricted, why follow-up excavation wasn't pursued, why authorities limited access despite obvious mysteries demanding resolution. The shaft threatened comfortable assumptions, challenged orthodox chronologies, suggested capabilities that conventional assessment of ancient cultures refused to acknowledge. Better to leave it flooded, better to prevent comprehensive investigation, better to maintain mystery than to risk discoveries that would force paradigm shifts archaeology wasn't ready to accept. The Osiris Shaft continues waiting as it has waited since her Wasser's team withdrew, since pumps stopped and water returned, since chambers refilled to levels that ancient engineering had designed them to maintain. The empty sarcophagus rests on its platform surrounded by water, the blocked passage guards whatever lies beyond, the 3 levels preserve their secrets in darkness 30 meters below the causeway where discovery vindicated Herodotus, where investigation raised questions that remain unanswered, where gateway to underworld stands both literal and metaphorical, both physical architecture and symbolic representation, both monument to forgotten knowledge and laboratory for transformation that modern world has largely forgotten how to recognize, much less how to properly utilize for purposes that ancient wisdom understood but that contemporary cultures must rediscover if humanity is ever to reclaim capabilities that patient stone preserves in flooded chambers beneath the plateau where Osiris guards his mysteries still.